I'm Jane Hanson. This week in the arena, we have a special guest with us for the entire show to share his unique perspective on the Catholic Church in America. George Weigel is a distinguished senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center in Washington, D.C. He is a theologian and an author, and he's in Brooklyn for the convention of the Polish American Priests Association. Also joining us, as always, is Father Kieran Harrington, the Vicar for Communications for the Diocese of Brooklyn, and Elizabeth Scalia, contributor to First Things magazine and author of the blog The Anchoress. Mr. Weigel, let us start with you. What do you think so far of the effect of the Obama administration and on Catholicism in the United States?
It's certainly pressing a lot of questions onto the church in the U.S., like specifically, what does it mean to be Catholic? And what does it mean to be a Catholic in public life? The administration has taken a very aggressive position against some of the positions that the church believes are crucial civil rights questions of our time, the protection of the right to life of every human person from conception until natural death. We are simply on two different sides of a variety of questions within that large issue. The administration has clearly sharpened a conflict with the Catholic bishops of the United States. And I would say that the Notre Dame graduation business is nothing other than an attempt to drive a wedge into what had been a solid front of Catholic resistance to these questions, into which trap, unfortunately, Notre Dame fell.
And Elizabeth, you look like you're dying to say something.
No, actually not. Just that's a unique perspective I hadn't heard before. I'd been busy thinking, oh gee, I don't like intellectual ghettos, and oh gee, the president's entitled to his opinion. And I hadn't thought at all about a strategery, as George W. Bush would say, being applied here.
But I think one of the questions that is interesting is how the intersection of the issues of human life and politics. I mean, you have Nancy Pelosi going to Rome, right, meeting the Holy Father. Just recently, Bill Richards, in fact, being brought by his bishop to meet the Holy Father, being praised for his work on the death penalty, when in fact his position on human life is as despicable as President Obama. So there's a question as to how do we handle this question of the dignity and sanctity of human life, and how do we interact with elected officials?
Well, it's a very serious problem when you have people who, like Nancy Pelosi and Vice President Biden, are not wink and nod Catholics in their own minds. I mean, they say, and I believe they mean, honestly, this is not a facade, that they consider themselves serious practicing Catholics. They're seriously practicing Catholics who simply have not gotten the message on what the bishops of the United States and the last two popes consider fundamental questions of justice. And that's a huge problem.
But then the question becomes why are the bishops unwilling to deny these elected officials Holy Communion, to bar them from Holy Communion? So there is a question as to what's the reaction of the church officially to these elected officials who are proponents of abortion rights, but at the same time, there's not an official sanction. It's really left to their own individual consciences as to whether or not they should receive communion or not.
I think this is a discussion that's going to continue for a long time, although I think it's going to accelerate and heat up. Because frankly, many bishops are tired of being rolled by people who say, I'm a serious Catholic, and manifestly are not living that out in the public square. So I think the question of how these people are to be treated within the family of the church,
right,
within the family of the church,
but isn't there
for their own sake. I mean, it's an act of charity to tell somebody, you're off the reservation and you got serious problems.
But isn't the challenge, I think, is that what ultimately can happen is that the church can be aligned simply with one political party, the Republican Party, because that's perceived as the party of life, and then you have a Democratic Party, which is, as Archbishop Burke said, a party of death. So how do you square this reality? Whereas ultimately you get manipulated by the Republican Party for their ends as well.
That undoubtedly goes on. It requires a lot of vigilance, and it requires a lot of tough-mindedness. I mean, pro-life people have to be ready to say to the Republican Party, should it come to that, we are out of here, the same way many of us, like me, finally said to the Democratic Party after the '92 convention, when Bob Casey was denied 5 minutes to address the life issues, I'm sorry, I'm out of here. I mean, I've walked once, I can walk twice.
But we have the fundamental issue of the separation of church and state here, and I understand you're talking about within their own Catholic religion, but these are people who are doing good in many other avenues of life. Why? We've got to find some sort of a reconciliation of when you're talking about the separation of church and state. It's just...
No, I don't think this has anything to do with the separation of church and state at all, A. And B, I'm not sure what great things Nancy Pelosi, my fellow ex-Baltimorean, has done in the course of her public life, except defend human rights in China, for which I will give her full marks. Look, there is a priority or a hierarchy of issues in the Catholic public conscience. Fundamental questions of justice. Who is a human person? What is owed to that person by reason of his or her humanity are at the top of the pile. That's why churchmen marched with Martin Luther King at Selma. That's why we have to keep pressing the life issues. And if that means people who are with us on some other stuff get ticked off, too bad.
Why are our arguments not being persuasive? How is it that we are not, touching the minds and hearts of the minds and hearts?
Maybe Elizabeth has some ideas on that.
I think sometimes we're way too strident, and I think we are on the side of angels, as George so well articulated, but we don't always come off as angels in how we present that side.
It seems almost repressive and regressive at times.
It does. I remember reading some forums online with Catholics who were objecting to Nancy Pelosi meeting with the Pope. And, she should be excommunicated, he should publicly excommunicate her. It was very strident, very lay down the law, and I felt like it gave the Holy Spirit no room to work.
Let me give you an example of a more positive take on this that I think is very effective. Last fall, I had the pleasure of addressing a dinner in Chicago in aid of the only pro-life crisis pregnancy center in the Loop. It's called Aid for Women. It's a great place. Some tens of thousands of women have been helped in this in the course of the last 30 years. And I gave what I thought was a pretty good stem winder of a speech on the life issues and the importance of this election and whatnot. A 28-year-old single mother who had been helped by this group got up with her 9-month-old kid to thank them at the end of the thing. And I turned to Cardinal George and said, what did you need me for? I mean, it was so much more effective to see the positive side of this. It's got to be both and. I mean, sometimes, I'm old-fashioned enough and from south of the Mason-Dixon line enough to know that you got to hit the jackass over the head with a 2x4 sometimes to get his attention. But most of the time, the Catholic no to certain things must be put in the context of the Catholic yes. And that yes has to be embodied by things such as service to women in crisis, which is the most effective pro-life thing I know.
And there is so much more to discuss here today as we continue with George Weigel. We'll be back in just a moment. Stay with us. Welcome back as we continue our discussion with George Weigel. We are joined now by Grant Gallicho, Associate Editor at Commonweal magazine. And I should say that during the last presidential campaign, you did do some consulting work.
I did.
Unpaid, volunteer.
Totally free.
For the Obama campaign, which of course means that you two may have a direct clash with the idea of how the president has affected Catholicism in the United States.
Maybe a slight one,
You heard George earlier. Your reaction?
I did. I guess I'm not entirely convinced by the notion that Obama is as hostile to the life issues as I've been hearing. There's a meme out there that he is in favor of abortion when he is in favor of abortion rights, and I think that's a distinction that gets lost.
But how do you say that, Grant? I mean, when he goes before National Organization of Women, and says his first priority is to sign into law the Freedom of Choice Act, which I mean is so hostile to the teachings of the church, and in fact is an imposition of a point of view upon people who are opposed to abortion. I mean, how do you come to that conclusion?
Well, I don't think Catholics ought to accept that kind of statement. But at the same time, that needs to be tempered with the fact that he went in front of Rick Warren and said that we have too many abortions in this nation, and we need to do something to reduce the number of them.
I'll give that point of view this much, Grant. I think the president, who is obviously very articulate, very intelligent, and a certain kind of intelligence, is the kind of what I would call postmodern liberal, who knows that you have to say, and in some sense believes, yes, we must respect the views of these less enlightened people. But he is immune to moral argument on this stuff. That stem cell speech was a parody of moral argument. He said we have to respect the views of those who take a different view of the moral status of the embryo, and then proceeded to ignore simply every argument that had ever been made. Why? Because I think he's convinced that there is a humane, progressive answer that is just simply there, and all right-thinking people will eventually come around to that.
But do you get, I mean, how do you come to the conclusion that in terms of the moral argument, because it would seem his position on torture, even on the war, right? I mean, unless it was simply a crass political decision, which is hard to come to at the time that it was made, was that it was not grounded in any sense of a deeper meaning of right or wrong.
Well, I've lived in Washington for 25 years, so nothing crass surprises me anymore. I'm surprised by uplift. I think the president probably thought that this was a dumb idea, prudentially, to go into Iraq. I'm not sure that he has any real understanding of the just war tradition, or that would have been the intellectual matrix through which he would have thought about
But
this.
the torture issue is interesting because it is immoral. There is a moral argument that's being made on the torture question.
Yeah, that's true, but there's also an enormous amount of moral posturing being done on that as well.
So how do you separate your argument from, the notion that basically the president must be lying about what he said, when he wanted to reduce the number of abortions, or when he wants, when he wants to end torture?
I don't think he's lying. I don't think he's connected the dots between ends and means on this. I don't think he understands that the incidence of abortion can be shown to rise dramatically under certain circumstances of deregulation of the abortion industry, and reduce when these abortuaries are regulated as least as much as your local Wendy's or Burger King.
Or bank.
Or bank. I don't think he's connected the dots on this. And it would be nice, I'd like to think he were interested. I'd like to think I could go into the Oval Office, as I've done with other presidents of both parties, and say, look, Mr. President, here are the facts of the matter, and here's the conclusion that I come to because of that. I'm not persuaded, at least on the basis of the first 100 days, that even if you did that, the answer would come out different at the policy level. Because I think we've done that on stem cells and it hasn't worked.
But you've seen the draft guidelines from the National Institutes of Health, and they seem to have, in some sense, responded to editorials like Commonweal's, which took the president to task for that stem cell speech.
I really have to defer to colleagues of mine on that. I'm writing a second volume on JP2, and
John Paul II.
John Paul II. I only take occasional polemics breaks like this. But I think there are real concerns among some of my colleagues who used to work on the President's Council on Bioethics that even these regulations still leave large cracks in the facade of protection that have been erected.
Well, I found it particularly interesting because in that speech, I mean, he did seem to pose religious views against scientific truth.
Not a good
and
idea.
Commonweal complained, along with a lot of other people. But if you look at the guidelines, I mean, he didn't.
Grant, I'm not sure that the people that
Sure.
might be watching
Yeah.
understand what these guidelines are, and I think we might be getting way too specific.
I'm sorry. Yeah, basically, the government has posed these draft guidelines, which will guide how federal funding will go into research in stem cell research. So whether it's through embryo destructive research or adult.
And basically, they have ruled that there can be no money that goes for the destruction of embryos, but only research that comes from from the lines that have already been derived. So I think the big question is so the argument is that they're not going to be paying for the destruction of embryos. What they are going to be paying for is the research that comes from the destroyed embryos.
What would have been nice in the president's speech, and would have been generous and would have been true, would have been for him to have acknowledged that President Bush, making a very unpopular decision, to which he gave serious moral consideration, in fact drove the research in this field in what turned out to be a positive direction, namely adult stem cell therapies that are actually helping people today, and that would likely not have happened had his predecessor not made a pretty gutsy call.
So let's go back to this original subject that we were talking about, which is the anti-choice, the pro-abortion, anti-abortion, pro-life stance. I mean, you talked about the bishops and that the bishops have had it with the way that they're being treated by politicians in this country. But honestly, if you're a young woman in the United States, right now we've got 3 white guys sitting around here talking about their lives. And I think that is a very difficult issue for Catholic women to deal with. How do you get to them?
We've got a white woman talking about the lives of American soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan. I don't think gender has anything to do with this, but you are certain, at the level of rational consideration, you are absolutely right, Jane, that the most effective pro-life witnesses the Church has are Marianne Glendon and Helen Alvarez and any number of others I can name who have walked the walk themselves and who know, as Elizabeth Matthews Green, Frederica Matthews Green, Anglican pro-life activist, has said more eloquently than anybody else, a woman trapped in the drama of a crisis pregnancy wants one thing, help. And if the only help this culture can offer her is the lethal resolution of her problem, then there's something really wrong. We have to offer a warmer, more humane form of help, because that's what that person is looking for at that moment. That's certainly been my experience in these situations.
But what's happening in terms of, I think on the broader question, on the broader cultural questions, whether it's gay marriage, whether it's abortion, on the broad issues, it seems that we are losing the argument. Our voice is being muted. It's not penetrating the hearts and minds of our own people. It's really important for us to say, well, many of the people who are having abortions are Catholic people. How is it that we haven't been able to convince our own people to not partake in this behavior? I mean, so from my perspective, I guess the question is what's not being done? What are we failing to do in order to touch hearts and minds? Do you take stony hearts and turn them into hearts of flesh?
At the sort of medium-term historical level, over the last 35 years since Roe versus Wade, we, the Church, pro-life activists, etc., did not sufficiently from the get-go attach this set of issues to the civil rights movement in its classic period, as this is the successor to the civil rights movement. Because the civil rights movement between 1955 and 1965 is the one agreed moral reference point in our public culture today. Everybody says that was a great thing. I think it's entirely plausible, and the life of my dear friend Richard John Newhouse proved this, who went from point A to point B. The pro-life movement is the successor to that great American moment of self-renewal and reform in our laws. That's at the public level. Inside the church, we did such a miserable job of teaching the church's sexual ethic. We did such a miserable job of handling the controversy over contraception and humanae vitae in 1968 that the moral cred was low. And as soon as the broader culture identified abortion as an issue of sexual liberation, not a fundamental principle of justice, we were down 9-0 in the first inning at that point.
Speaking of down to the last inning, we're going to take a quick break and we'll be back with some final thoughts right after this, so hold that moment. And we are back with author and theologian George Weigel. You wrote the definitive biography of John Paul II, and now we are 4 years into Pope Benedict as Pope. What are the comparisons, and how do you think Benedict is doing?
There's been a great continuity of teaching, and yet these are obviously very different personalities. I have to explain to friends in the secular world all the time that changing popes is not like changing governors or mayors or presidents. New pope doesn't make it up in terms of policy the way we're used to policy shifts going. Popes are custodians of the tradition, and both of these men are that. John Paul II was a much more gregarious public personality, if you will. This is a pope who is more at home in his library, writing really stunningly good homilies, audience addresses. He has a fantastic ability, which frankly John Paul II did not have to so great a degree. Benedict XVI has a fantastic ability to take the most complicated and arcane bits and pieces of the catechism and make them come alive for people through biblical stories and other stories.
He just really, there was a compendium to the catechism that was one of the first things. It was on John Paul's desk when he died, and that's one of the things that he had worked on. And what I found really compelling about it was that it brings the catechism to life in our modern day world and talks about things like green space and protecting our resources and the modern media and how to deal with them in a realistic way as a Catholic. So I think that addresses exactly what you're talking about.
I think you go back to his, I thought, really wonderful homily in St. Patrick's Cathedral a year ago, where he took the materials of the cathedral, stone and glass and human lives, and wove them into this really quite remarkable reflection on the church, which, like a Gothic cathedral, sometimes looks dark and forbidding from the outside, but once you're inside, is full of light and warmth. I mean, that's a guy who knows how to teach. I mean, he's a great teacher.
What were the lessons that Benedict learned from John Paul II, both the good and the bad? What do you think that, in terms of the differences in the way he's approached to the pontificate, not simply stylistically, but differences, or maybe more fundamental differences in the way he's approached the pontificate?
I think one of the things he unfortunately learned from John Paul II is that you can let the curia manage itself, which I think he has learned to his discomfort is not the case. The Pope was very badly served in the flap over the Lefebvre's bishops and this crazy man, Richard Williamson, et cetera, et cetera. He's been badly served in other ways. I mean, even the most evangelically compelling, publicly presentable Pope has got to do some hands-on management at a certain point, and I think he has now come to recognize that.
Speaking of hands-on management, you're very good friends with the new Archbishop of New York, and very quickly, any advice for him?
We've been talking a lot here about the Catholic yes and the Catholic no. Archbishop Dolan will make sure that the yes is front and center. He embodies a joyful, compelling, orthodox Catholicism in a way that is perhaps singular in the American hierarchy. He is made to order for New York City, and it's going to be a great ride for everybody.
But the Yankees haven't been winning.
I, as a native Baltimorean, do not find that a problem.
Thank you so much
My
for being
pleasure.
with us. We really appreciate your
Great to be
time
here.
and your effort. And Father Harrington, as usual.
Thank you, Jane.
Thank you. And thank you once again for joining us. A reminder, the net is always on online, and you can watch this program and so much more at www.netny.net. I'm Jane Hanson. See you next time in the arena.